Welcome to a flying video with flight level 180. Today we are looking at a Debonair C33. This is a 1966 Debonair C33, which makes it 57 years old at the time of the video. It's hard to believe looking at how beautiful and modern looking the design is. It's powered by a 260 horsepower Continental IO 470N, which is a very, very nice engine. It has a 6 cylinders on the engine. It's fuel injected. It has GAM ejectors, which are balanced fuel injectors. Performance-wise, it gets up in the, approaching 160 knots at around 11 gallons per hour. You can run it a little faster by making it a little bit more rich, but that's a nice economy cruise setting, and it's really excellent speed for the fuel burn. Its useful load is around 1,030 pounds. Not an enormous useful load, but not bad. It's generally a 3-person airplane if you don't fill all the tanks. And as to how much fuel all the tanks hold, it has 2 tanks in the wings, one left, one right, and it has 2 tip tanks, and it has 84 gallons usable. So, you can fly 7-8 hours with reserves in this airplane before you need to land. So it's got quite an impressive range. As for the propeller, it's a variable pitch propeller, which means you can control the pitch of the propeller in the speed of the propeller in the cockpit, and that combined with the horsepower over 200 horsepower make it high performance. And it also has retractable gear, which make it a complex airplane. As to what it's similar to, it's very, very similar to a Bonanza. It's made by the same company. It was made in parallel starting in the 60s. It's a, quote, lower cost alternative to the Bonanza. And over time, it morphed into a very, very close, much closer equivalent to the Bonanza. And eventually, the 33 series became called Bonanzas. And the most recent one that was made was the F-33A Bonanza, which is very similar to this airplane, just a little bit more advanced. As for the performance, the airplane is pretty intense. It's very fast, especially in a descent. You really have to watch yourself to make sure you don't go into the yellow and the red. It's much more complex than a trainer. There's a lot to think about when you're flying this airplane when you compare it to a 172 or even a 182. It's a pretty challenging airplane. That said, though, it's really a great airplane. It handles beautifully. It's agile. It feels great. It's just a wonderful airplane to fly. I love this airplane. As for the market value, it's worth around $150,000 US dollars as it's currently configured. It has a pretty high time engine, but on the flip side, it has a very, very good cockpit. Has an autopilot and a very nice GPS navigator that we'll see in a little bit. And as we look at it, you're going to notice this is not a perfect airplane. It's 57 years old, and as you'd expect, there's chips in the paint, there's wear and tear from usage, there's worn seats. It just looks a little well used, as most airplanes look, just because they get used. But it's an excellent mechanical condition, and you'll see that when you look inside. We're going to look at everything in this airplane. We're going to look at the inside, we're going to look at the outside, we're going to look at the instruments, we're going to look at the engine, we're going to look at everything. So let's go ahead and jump right into the details of the airplane. Looking at the front of the airplane, you can see the variable pitch props and the air inlets into the engine. And then there's I believe that's a landing light there. And then underneath, you can see the retractable gear that retracts back up into the body. And over here, you can see the cowling is opened by unscrewing those 3 screws, and that allows you to open the cowling. When you go up on top of the cowling, you can actually see the oil access door. And what you do is you just push on the back of it and it pops it right open. And you can see right there's the oil filler. You just insert the oil right there. And then underneath here, I'm pulling out the oil dipstick. And it's a little bit hard to pull out, as you can see. And then you just pop that back in there. And that's pretty much it. And then you can see there the oil level is 8 minimum and 10 maximum. And to close it, you just close it just like that. Underneath the fuselage, you can see the exhaust. And In front of that, you can see these cowl flaps, and these are doors that you can open or close in flight that change the cooling characteristics of the airplane. And down here, there's a door that contains a fuel strainer. So you can actually go in, you open this door, and you get a sample of fuel to make sure there's no water or other impurities in the fuel before you fly. Now let's take a peek inside the engine compartment. I unscrewed the screws for the cowling, and you just lift it up, and then you drop that down and put it into the latch there to hold it up. And it's a really nice feature. Compared to the Cessnas, you can't actually look at the engine like this, and I think it's a big safety feature to be able to look at the engine. So this is it. You can see it looks pretty clean and generally pretty good shape, and you can see there is the vacuum pump, and that's what drives the gyro instruments inside the cockpit. And those are the cylinders. There's 3 on this side and 3 on the other side. And you can see there's this is called the spider. This is the fuel distribution unit. This sends fuel to the fuel injectors, and that's where the fuel injectors are. And those are the spark plugs that I'm pointing to there. And that there is the magnetos. The magnetos are sending, there's one on each side, and there's magnetos sending spark to the spark plugs to ignite the fuel air mixture. And other than that, that's pretty much it. Now let's go ahead and look at the left side of the engine. It looks pretty similar, but there's a few things that are unique here. You can see there's an alternator belt right there. You want to check to make sure that's in good shape. And this is the alternator itself. Pretty straightforward there. And then over here you can see the other 3 cylinders. Same fuel injector and spark plugs. You can see the magneto over here. This is the left magneto. There's 2, of course. And this is the oil cap. It's you just unscrew it and pour the oil in, and then screw it right back on. And then, of course, the dipstick. It's a great feature that you can actually go and look at the condition of the engine before you fly. It makes me nervous every time I'm in one of the Cessnas that, you really can't see what's going on. So it is a good thing. Now let's start looking at the right side of the airplane. You can see the cowl flap there and the doors that cover the landing gear when you bring up the gear. And there is a little bit of a vent that brings cabin air in. You can see that pretty well. And then there's a fuel vent for any fuel overflow. And to the left of that, there's a bit of a vortex separator, which allows you to have the stall to start inboard instead of out by your ailerons, which is important. And this door here is the fuel access door. So you unscrew it, and there's a cap, and there you can see the fuel in the tanks right there. And pretty simple. It's nice. You can actually screw them down. It's pretty good for airflow. Then you can see another vortex separator right there, I believe it's called, and that causes an inboard stalls to happen earlier inboard than outboard. You can see some chips in the paint here as we go along the wing. And you get out to the end, and there is the tip tank. And that holds 20 gallons. It's got the lights in the end of it. And sliding around to the side of the tip tank, you can see there's a door where you can actually insert the fuel and view the fuel. And pretty straightforward. And then you close the little flap. I didn't really get it closed there. I have to fix that. But that allows you to close the door down. And then as we come around to the back of the wing, on the outboard is the aileron. And you can see you can move that. We don't have the control lock on. It's a little bit tough to move because there's bungees that make it a little bit more resistant. And these are the flaps. And as you can see, those do not move. And they're a little bit smaller in dimension than those flaps on the Cessnas. And over here you see some areas where you can step up on the wing to get to the doors and the single door. And this is the door opening, and you just pull that and that opens the door. Pretty straightforward. Behind the wing you can find the baggage door, and it's not very big. And to open it you just push this little button and it pops right open. And looking in there, not a ton of space here. You can fit a couple suitcases and not much else. We have some equipment, some tools, and some cleaning supplies. And then we have the tow bar, which you can connect to the nose gear and move the airplane around. But, basically a small space, but not huge. And up there you can see there's a little bit of a hat shelf, and that's pretty much it. Looking at the top of the fuselage, you can see there's some antennas there. I believe that's a it's a nav antenna, and there's an air scoop that brings some air into this fuselage, and there's some GPS antennas and the beacon, and then another comm antenna up there. And then back here is the vertical stabilizer. You can see the ELT antenna right there, and there's a beautiful vertical stabilizer with a couple of antennas at the top, and then the Beechcraft logo. Sliding down to look at the horizontal stabilizer, you can see there's a few dents, and there's a chip in the paint, but generally in good shape. And the front is fixed, and then back here you have the pitch elevator for pitch, and you can actually move it. I don't have the lock on, and it's quite heavy. And if you look here, this is the trim tab for pitch, and it's quite large, much larger than the Cessna's. You can see the bolts that connect it in. Pretty straightforward there. And then you can see here is the rudder, which is very large. You have a lot of rudder authority in this airplane. I think it has a 17-knot crosswind demonstrated cross crane for landing. And if you look down here at the very tip of the fuselage, you can see there's a light there. Taking a quick look at the back of the left wing, there is the flap, and there's the aileron, same as on the right side, pretty straightforward. And there's our tip tank. And heading to the front of the left wing, you can see there's the same vent and the same fuel access door. And sliding out, there's I believe the same access panel as on the other wing, but underneath on this side, there is the pitot tube, which is in conjunction with your pitot system, gives you the airspeed. And over here we have the stall warning horn. It's a flap just like in the 182. And heading out to the end of the wing, there's the tip tank. Let's go ahead and look underneath the wing. Now this is the left main landing gear, and you can see it's pretty stout. It's very solid landing gear. You can see the brake disc on the side there. It's a little dirty, as you'd expect from something that's going through oil on the runway, but generally in good shape. And then you can see a landing light there that goes away when you close the gear. And this is a fuel drain point, a sump point, and you can see that one. That's the door that we saw earlier. This is the second one of 3. Now let's go ahead and jump into the interior, and I'm going to use photos instead of videos here just because the lighting quality will be better. And these are the rear seats. As you can see, they're very nice with a nice logo. I mean, they look worn. They've probably been, 20 years ago they are last redone, but they're comfortable and pretty roomy for the backseat passenger. And of perhaps equal or greater importance is how much leg room is there. And there's not a lot. I mean, these are, coach seats on an airliner. Not really a huge amount of leg room, but I've seen worse in some airplanes. Now jumping up to the front, these are the front seats. You can see they're pretty similar to the other seats and generally comfortable. There's a little bit of room between you and the guy riding to your side, so I'd say it's a comfortable cockpit in general. Now let's take a peek at what every pilot considers to be the most important part of the airplane, which is the instrument panel. And as you can see, it's a mix of legacy instruments and some very modern instruments, the original airplane instruments that came with the airplane, and some things that have been added over the years. And I think you'll find it very interesting as we go through everything in depth. Starting with the far left side of the panel, you can see what's maybe the simplest instrument in here, and this is the temperature gauge, and gives you the outside air temperature in Fahrenheit and Celsius, the pressure altitude, the density altitude, and gives you a readout on the voltage in the system for the electrical system. Moving over to the right, you can see this is the airspeed indicator, and it is in knots. There's no miles per hour on this airplane. And you can see that the yellow line, which is the caution range or smooth air speed, is 162 knots. Or thereabouts. And it's really easy to get to that speed in this airplane. When you start descending, it's a bit of a struggle and something you really have to pay attention to make sure it doesn't get up to into that yellow arc. So definitely something to keep an eye on. And to the right of that is the attitude indicator, which is a vacuum driven instrument, and that's something you rely on heavily in instrument flight, and is probably original to this airplane. It probably came out of the factory with this particular gauge, like the airspeed indicator. And to the right of that is, of course, the factory altitude indicator. This airplane has a service ceiling in the high teens, so it's pretty capable when you can of getting up into high altitudes. This is the turn coordinator, which is an electrically driven gyroscopic instrument, and on the bottom you have the ball, which shows you the quality of your turn. This particular instrument couples with the Nav1 radio, and you can operate it with driven by GPS or driven by standard traditional radio waves. And as you can see, it has both horizontal guidance, which is the vertical line, and it has vertical guidance, which is on the glide slope, which is the horizontal line. In the center here is the Sandell HSI, or horizontal situation indicator, and this is obviously not an original stock instrument. It was something that was added later. This is one of the very early digital HSIs, and is a very capable instrument. It gives you heading and nav functions and drives the autopilot. To the right of that is the VSI, or vertical speed indicator, which is a pitot-static instrument. To the left on the bottom row is the autopilot, and this is an STEC 50. It's a moderately capable autopilot. It does heading and roll stabilization. It has a nav mode, and most importantly has an altitude hold mode. It doesn't support vertical speed or anything like that, but once you get to altitude, it does do a very nice job of holding altitude. These are the legacy engine gauges, and you can see on the left there is the electrical system, and on the right are the two main tanks, and at the bottom row there's some temperature gauges. It's a lot less useful now that we have an engine monitor in this airplane, but they are there for backup if you need them. On the far right is the backup directional gyro, but it's not really super useful because the Sandell does everything this gyro does and more. And last but not least, the upper arrow is pointing to the master and alternator switch, and the lower arrow is pointing to the key that activates the starter and the magnetos. Let's look at the right side of the panel, where almost everything has been upgraded over the years. Now in the top left you can see the one gauge that came from the factory, and on the left side of that gauge, indicated by the left arrow, is the manifold pressure gauge, and that's approaching 30 inches of manifold pressure as we're sitting on the ground near sea level. And on the right side you can see the fuel flow gauge, so max fuel flow is in the low 20s, and if you look at the little arrow on the right, you can see it's not 100% useful as it would be, because there's actually a fuel flow on the engine monitor underneath. So you can use either one. They pretty much agree perfectly. As you can tell, the engine monitor is a very modern piece of equipment and a pretty recent add-on. This is, I believe, a JPI 730. And those two arrows, the top arrow, I believe, points to the EGTs, and the bottom arrow points to the CHTs, so exhaust gas temperature and cylinder head temperature, and you can tell it hits all 6 cylinders, so it really gives you a ton of information about the engine. And on the right side you can see oil temperature, your fuel flow, your fuel remaining, and such forth. So a really powerful piece of equipment that pretty much you want to have in any airplane that you own. You don't want to be without it. At the bottom of the stack on the right, the very bottom, at the bottom arrow, that is the transponder. It's a Garmin transponder. And above that you have a radio number 2. So that has your comms and your navigation radios for the second radio. Now let's focus on the GPS unit. This is a Garmin GNS 750. It's a very expensive piece of equipment. About 20 grand to have a new one installed in your airplane. It is incredibly capable though, and really impressive. Starting in the top left, you can see the radio features. So the primary radio channel is the green one, and then above that, next to that on the right, you can see the audio panel controls and various audio settings, and you can actually interface with the transponder here and set the transponder on this device, and on the far right you can see the nav frequencies. And then as you look below, you can see the GPS map, and you get traffic on this map, and you get obviously your location and airspace and courses and everything else. It's a really impressive, capable piece of equipment that I could spend an hour talking about all the things it could do. Now, sliding over to the far right side of the panel, you can see obviously the tip tank fuel gauge is there, and you can switch back and forth between each tip tank by using the little silver switch on the bottom right. And the bottom left switch allows you to cross feed, so that would allow you to suck fuel out of both tanks at the same time. But that's marked as in op and we don't use it. Underneath that, you can see the Hobbs meter, so that keeps track of your runtime. And to the right of that is your ELT, or emergency locator transmitter control. And above that, you have the suction gauge, so that's to make sure you have enough suction to run the vacuum system. Let's move down to the bottom half of the panel, and in the center here, this is between the legs of the two pilots. You can see some really important controls. And the top left, the black knob, is the throttle, and that is pulled all the way out, so that means the throttle is closed. And to the right of that, that little silver switch is the auxiliary fuel pump, and when you flip that on, that helps you with starting and helps you when you run a tank dry in flight and such forth. To the right of that is the propeller control. As I told you, there's a variable pitch propeller on this airplane, so you control it with that. Pushed all the way in, that's maximum RPM, which is around 2650, and pulled all the way out, you can slow it down. And underneath that white knob is the alternate air system, so that basically if your pitot tubes or static ports gets iced over, you can pull that out. To the left of that, the red knob is the mixture control. So this controls the ratio of fuel you're sending to the engine, and that's an incredibly complex topic, so we won't go into that in depth. Underneath that, you can see the fire extinguisher, and at the very bottom, you can see the indicator for the front landing gear. So if that is, you can see now it's down, and when you lift the gear, that says up, and that's a mechanical switch that is a very important indicator for you to check when you raise the gear. On the far left side on the floor, you can see the fuel control valve, and there's 5 settings here: off, left main, right tip, and left tip. Pretty straightforward stuff, and that just tells you which tank you're draining from. Looking at the rudder pedals, there's an interesting feature here that I'm pointing out with my finger. This is an adjustable pedal, so you can actually push that little slider and then move the pedals towards you or away from you. So if you're a tall pilot, you can actually get some extra legroom, which is really nice. And these pedals have toe brakes on the top, so you stop the airplane or use differential braking by pushing the top of the pedal. Now, one of the challenges of Bonanzas and Debonairs is that when you have a dual yoke setup like we have here, and that's an important note, you can actually buy a single yoke that you can move between the passenger and the pilot and co-pilot in flight. So it's a really neat feature you can get, but we have a dual yoke in this one, and it does tend to block some of the instrument panel, and it makes it a little bit difficult to see. But that said, let me walk through some of those items that are hard to see. And I have the yoke pulled all the way back towards me so we can see them clearly. So on the far left, you have the elevator trim indication, and you can see it centered on 0 there. And to the right of that, you have the cowl flaps, and pulled out, they're open. And the cowl flaps are those doors, if you remember, that are around the exhaust. And to the right of that is the flap switch. And to the right of that, you have 2 light controls for internal lighting, and to the right of that you have the landing gear switch when it's clearly down. You have the strobe light, one of the landing lights, and you have a parking brake that you pull to turn it on. And up to the left and right at the top there, you can see on the left that's a flap indicator, and on the right you can see the gear indicator, and that's the gear indicator for the main landing gear. And if you recall, the nose landing gear indicator is a mechanical switch on the floor. Now, moving farther to the right, you can see where we left off with the parking brake. To the right of that is the rotating beacon switch, and the nav lights, and the pitot heat to turn on the heat on the pitot tube, and cabin heat and defrosting to the right of that. And underneath you can see a whole row of fuses that if they pop out, that usually means there's some sort of electrical issue. That wraps up our incredibly detailed overview of the C33 Debonair. I love this airplane. It's really a fantastic airplane to fly. Fun, fast, agile, just a real pleasure. And in terms of, complex airplanes that are a reasonable value, this one is really up at the top of the list. It's a great airplane and it's incredibly capable for the price. As for what's next, we're going to look at a rental Cherokee 160. It's sitting out in the sun on the ramp, so I'm going to hold off until things cool down a bit because I don't want to get cooked. But I think you'll find it interesting to see the difference between a rental airplane and a club airplane. So thanks for sticking with me, and see you in the next video. Flight Level 180 signing off.